It's go time.
Welcome to Quick Kicks here on Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
And welcome back, everyone, to the podcast. Don Charbin along with Heath Graham. As we peered through the news media this week, we heard some consequential news coming out of Regina, where a fentanyl bust led to the arrest of two members of the Regina Rams football team. They are alleged to have been a part of this, and they are awaiting a court date.
This could be a very upsetting story for the Regina Rams and their football organization. Again, at this point, we need to choose our words carefully. They have been arrested and charged, but not convicted, and no guilty pleas have been entered at this point. So it is in the hands of the courts. But the accusations are pretty substantial, with a large amount of fentanyl seized, and the proceeds of crime and conspiracy to traffic the controlled substances can be a pretty devastating set of charges that these players are facing.
Exactly why we have to tread lightly. These persons' careers are really now up for grabs, especially at first when you look at youth sport, but then when you look at a potential move into the professional ranks, if this comes to pass and if there is a consequence of conviction, your professional football career is all but done for the interim. It's two members of the team that are from Toronto that have been charged by the Regina Police Service. We know one is Tarek Polius, who's a highly touted prospect, and he was a defensive lineman. The other is Michael Jourdain, defensive back, and they are facing 9 charges. Let's get away from what is happening to them personally. Let's move to now, what do the Regina Rams do as a university team? It's kind of, they live in a different spot than most. They're kind of akin to Laval, where the team itself is run independently, but through the university. So they've got a different relationship. If you have ever followed the University of Regina, all the rest of the teams are called Cougars. But in this one instance, the Rams football team, which was part of the Prairie Junior Football Conference, moved into the university ranks with the help of Frank McChrystal, especially, who was insistent upon it. And they moved into youth sport and compete now against the Huskies of Saskatchewan and Calgary Dinos, Alberta Golden Bears, etc.
At this point, the organization will be in damage control mode, and I'm sure the university especially is going to want to distance themselves as far as possible from the connection with these players. Now, there are 3 other people that were charged in this crime as well, so it's not strictly students at the University of Regina or players involved with the Regina Rams that are involved in this criminal investigation and these charges. It does kind of paint a bad picture in the eyes of a lot of people. I guess you're, in a sense, guilty by association. And if these were the players that the team recruited and brought into Regina to participate for the team, representing the city and the province as well. But there's a lot that goes into those recruiting sessions. And obviously, the team and university weren't aware. We don't know exactly when these crimes began that they're charged with as well. So there's a lot of pieces come together to paint the whole picture.
The university, I'm certain, will be not only in damage control in a sense, but certainly will be looking to educate. There's going to be a movement from the campus to really address the issue at hand. Do some self-evaluation at first, then your message becomes stronger. But there certainly is going to be just some discussion through the coaching staff, through the university athletic department, with the players, because this is going to have an impact on them. Not only the fact that now the program is coming under more scrutiny, but just what do they feel? How was the relationship with those players? How do they feel about them facing these charges? All that sort of stuff has to be addressed.
And U-Sport as an organization as well. This is going to be a situation where they're going to have to look at all of the programs across the country and in all sports that participate, and how can we be better as an organization to educate these players about the dangers of all these kinds of activities that are involved in this case as well. And with that many people that participate in university athletics and the number of university students across the country, it's a pretty substantial population. And you can't single out that something went wrong with U Sport because of two people charged, but I think it's an opportunity for U Sport as a whole to improve the direction of student athletes.
It requires so much education right now and counseling on some level. And U Sport, I know, will be very on top of what's going on. The University of Regina will be as well, and the Regina Rams football team. No one's going to take this lightly. Of course, this has to play out, but just the accusation alone has and will send shockwaves throughout communities.
In all walks of life and in all industries, institutions, there are people that get wrapped up in things that they shouldn't. This shouldn't be a reflection on this football program, this school, this city by any means. You can go through lists of former athletes of many sports that have been involved in illegal activity. Unfortunately, it is likely a situation where it's going to have lifelong impact on these two young men and the five in general that are involved in this case. It's not something that will be able to quickly go away.
Fentanyl right now is high on the agenda. Given what's happening with Canada-U.S. relations, we know that there is probably much more emphasis really diving through this and getting to where the bottom line is on all of this. So you've got to know that the Regina Police Service isn't going to be taking this lightly either. They're going to do their due diligence to figure out what was going on and when was it happening. Now, does that later mean that somebody doesn't get charged in the end? It's quite possible.
It's certainly a story worth keeping an eye on as we learn more and as it progresses its way through the court system.
The International Federation of American Football has selected Jim Mullin to chair their Global Tackle Football Task Force, which, according to that organization, will evaluate the state globally of tackle football and its sustainability, growth, competitiveness, inclusivity, all of these factors coming together to see what that will mean for other leagues outside of North America.
To kind of paint it all under one brush, this type of football, tackle football, if you will, is very much a North American game. Yes, we can debate the differences between Canadian football and American football, but at the end of the day, it's different than soccer and different than rugby, and that's where this International Federation of American Football comes in. Jim Mullin is a man who has done a lot for football across this country for many, many years, including being the longtime president of Football Canada. This is a great hire by the organization because I think his Canadianness brings a lot to the table as well. If they're looking globally for the impact of football and how it's doing, getting somebody outside of the U.S. that's involved with very successful football programs is a great move, and I'm sure he has a lot of contacts globally that he can reach out to really dig into this.
One of the things that football lacks that is much more prevalent in other sports, I'll use basketball for instance. The sport is universally played almost, where with football, not so. And one of the things you have to do is look at why is it that certain areas of the planet do not have football as part of their programs of availability. And if they do, why do some fail and what is happening that causes them to fail? And this is part of this process that you have to go through because this is a burgeoning game. As much as the NFL is the giant and it dominates the specter in this area, that's not necessarily the case everywhere else. Yes, the NFL is felt over there, but local leagues are not getting NFL support. They have to do it themselves, and this is what they're having to address. How do we get A, players, B, leagues, and C, viability?
Part of how you get viability is that we're less than 4 years away from flag football being an Olympic sport. I think the timeliness of this in conjunction with flag football becoming part of the Olympic Games, is the chance to grow the game globally. It's to get more eyeballs. The NFL's had a great initiative of playing regular season games overseas in Europe. They have done for a number of years. They've looked at opportunities in Canada and in Mexico as well to grow that brand of football. And as you mentioned, the NFL is absolutely the juggernaut. And regardless of people playing American football globally, there's recognition globally of the NFL and what it is as a sports league. Now we're looking at how we grow from there. And there has been World League of American Football, NFL Europe. There's the X League in Japan. So there are football leagues around. And this is an opportunity, I think, to kind of bring them more together under one umbrella for the betterment of the game in general.
You mentioned flag football coming in at the Los Angeles Olympics. But one of the things that I think tackle football is looking at is flag is making its way through that system, but we're not, at least not yet. Granted, the tackle football that is played on the gridiron is certainly much more violent and it demands more of the body. It means that they have to figure out how to get that acceptance. Places like South America, where the NFL again is going back into Brazil to play another regular season game, the acceptance of the game, that's great to have the hype, that generates some interest, but then what do you do the weeks after? And that's what these guys have to address. If you want to get leagues going, you have to do something to make it happen where it is sustainable. You have to carry that momentum somewhere.
Funding is a big part of it as well. You look at what some of the global games are, and soccer, or traditional football, if you will, is one of the largest spectator sports in the world and one of the most played sports in the world, because all you really need is a ball. And I've seen video of people playing with a ball of rags and barefoot playing soccer. Football requires a lot more equipment, a lot better setup. Yes, you can play sandlot football, and I'm sure a lot of people listening did that kind of thing as kids as well. But to have an organized league, the amount of equipment, the amount of players required to operate a football league is a lot higher, and I think that's where some of the challenges are.
It requires much more orchestration, diligence. It requires much more management. It requires so much more operational setup and cost. And this is where tackle is always up against it, because typically whether you look at the NFL style of 11 or the Canadian style of 12, you need over 20 people to play the game, minimally, where you don't have those requirements in almost any other sport. Maybe soccer could approach that given the number of subs they have. So it requires so much more. It just demands, and this is what they've got to address. How do we make this palatable? How do we make this work? And then not only make it work, but then sustaining. They've got to make a report this spring. They've got to say something about all of this. CFL's got 2.0. This is part of its initiative. If you want to see more global players coming into the league, we've seen a roster spot held for them, but if you want more, you're going to have more people. And if you can get this competition between countries, between leagues, between federations, then I think it's going to grow and it's going to take care of itself. You just need that starting point to work.
You do, and I think Jim Mullin is the right man for the job. He's got a tall order in front of him. He's got a lot of connections and a lot of history in the game that are going to help him out along the way.
Hi, this is Jamie Rydell from TSN, producer, and you're listening to the Third Down Gamble.
Hot off the press at CFL.ca is the way too early Amsoil power rankings. Defending champion Toronto Argonauts are at the top of the list, and we can work our way all the way down to the Calgary Stampeders in the number 9 spot. Is there any value to power rankings when we're still in free agency?
Everything right now is on paper. Nobody has taken to the field yet, and you're one to really argue that without a game being played, there's nothing much to base anything on. However, if you just look at talent and you look at who managed to score and who managed to withstand losses, how do you argue with the Argos and the Blue Bombers not going back? The question for each is, how much did the hits matter? And when you look at Winnipeg, especially, like Kenny Lawler, Terrell Ford out of there, I think Big Hill is quietly going to be missed the most.
He is, but he's also the one that was least surprising to see back given his injuries. And we haven't seen Adam Bighill sign with another team at this point either. Terrell Ford and Kenny Lawler were sought after free agents that, in Kyle Walter's mind, priced themselves out of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers plan. I think Adam Bighill aged out, and yes, he's a big loss because of what he does on defense, but they believe they're better and faster moving on from him.
If we want to get deeper into this, I'm going to argue that because there's more to being bigger than and faster. There is also intelligence. And Adam Bighill could see things on a football field that most ordinary players do not. He was the captain. He was the quarterback of the defense. And they used to slot him all over the field just to throw off the offense. And Adam Bighill could adapt, adjust, and was still able to influence no matter where he started to line up. That, to me, you can't ever countenance in terms of its impact. You're never going to see that again. So how is Jones ever going to come back with that kind of stuff? Then, what about in the locker room? He was a leader. How much are they going to miss that? You need guys that stand up in the room and say, look, follow me.
That is, I think, the bigger hit than what he's done on the field over the last couple of years because of injury. I think the intangible is what he brings as a leader and as a voice for that defense. There isn't anybody else on the defense right now that jumps out at me as that type of player. Brandon Alexander is still a free agent as well. So if you take the safety and the middle linebacker who are veterans and have seen and done a lot in this league out of the equation, those are some big holes to fill. Now, I always say that you can look at these rosters on paper and you try to come up with this order right now, and we will do the same. We'll get into our predictions of how we see the season playing out, but we kind of wait a little bit later when we see some roster cuts, some additions and some subtractions. At this point, when it's just names on a page, I find it pretty hard to evaluate. We can move on down the list here. Saskatchewan Roughriders are slotted in at the number 3 spot. Montreal Alouettes at the number 4 spot. Again, both these teams were well established in the playoffs and were beat out by the Grey Cup participants. So not a lot of surprise in how this one played out for the 3 and 4 spots.
In these Amsoil rankings that they've put out, they've also got BC as the 8th best team in the league. Now, is that recency bias based on how BC fell apart down the stretch and stumbled and bumbled with that quarterbacking controversy into the playoffs? I kind of think that BC is going to be better than that. But again, you and I will have our show. We're hoping Derek Taylor comes on, and maybe Dave Thomas too, if he'll agree, to get some more ideas about how this is all going to play out. Because as you say, right now with just free agency, these guys are basically doing pressers right now saying how excited they are to be with their new team. They haven't looked really at a playbook yet.
In my opinion, you can safely pencil in Toronto at number 1, Calgary at number 9. Anywhere in between that, arguments can be made for moving any of these teams up and down. Just a quick rest of the lineup here. They've got Hamilton at number 5, Ottawa Red Blacks at number 6, the Edmonton Elks at 7, and BC at 8, ahead of Calgary in 9. There's a lot of hype and excitement for the Edmonton Elks. They've got a new coach in place, a lot of players coming in, some new excitement there. Are they being disrespected only being at 7? Again, there's so many moving parts to this. Hamilton Tiger Cats missing the playoffs last year have jumped up to 5 ahead of a couple of playoff teams as well. We're deep into the free agency window now and looking at additions and subtractions for teams, there are some that haven't really had a lot of movement. Montreal has only brought in 3 new players, while on the other end of the spectrum, Hamilton has brought in 10 and Edmonton has signed 12 new free agents.
Interestingly, if you look at Hamilton and Edmonton specifically, only 4 players from the Tiger Cats have signed elsewhere, where with Edmonton, 10 of them have. That's going to be a tremendous transition going on in Edmonton. When you think of 22 people that are either in or out, that's almost an entire starting lineup that is gone. Now, granted, it isn't exactly that, but if you look at the changes that are going on in Edmonton, and I know I keep drumming on this, Chris Morris, I want continuity and I want consistency and I want play, but you got to start somewhere. You've got to build a team that you want to have around. And Edmonton this year with Ed Hervey, he had a mission. He had an agenda that was going to be, I'm spending on these guys because we got to fix this and that. This being their defensive line and that being their defensive secondary.
Exactly that. And as much as Chris Morris talked about stopping the revolving door, we knew it had to swing around for a little bit longer to get what they wanted in. As a full new regime of president, general manager, and head coach, it would be foolish to just go with the roster that you were given and not put your stamp on it. So you absolutely cannot fault them for this. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers is the one that you've talked about recently of the losses that they've had. As of right now, they've pretty much gone 1 for 1. They have signed 8 new free agents. They've had 8 players sign elsewhere. I think it's the caliber of players moving out that has been the biggest concern for them.
I agree. The Blue Bombers especially, you look at the top-tier players that have left, and they haven't found top-tier players coming back. Now, Jarrett Stearns, you could say, okay, he's a pretty good receiver, did very well with the Rough Riders, but I don't know if that is what they need to solve their woes. And do they have the confidence that they can go out and recruit new corners and settle that area down? Because losing Terrell Ford back there, not only was he good at his position, but he's another guy that could see the field and figure things out.
I would say the biggest addition so far has been Vaughters on the defensive line. The biggest loss outside of Adam Bighill, who has not signed with another team yet, so he isn't in these numbers, but I agree Terrell Ford is the biggest loss. As much as Kenny Lawler is a flashy receiver, if you look at the facts, he hasn't really played a full season of 18 games in quite some time. He's been often injured. He's right around the 1,000-yard mark, which you would expect. But you mentioned Stearns. Dylan Mitchell comes in as well. Reggie White Jr. There's 3 capable CFL receivers that are coming in. It might be a little bit of the Moneyball math of replacing one super value with 3 lesser value, but the sum of the parts is going to equal that performance.
But you brought up injuries, and this is Reggie White. Remember last year with Montreal, spent a lot of the time on injured reserve. You want people that can play. Your most important ability is your availability. And if the Bombers are getting players that are injury prone, you're not really solving much of the Kenny Lawler equation.
Very true.
The Hamilton Tiger Cats, as you mentioned, heavy into signing, and most of them came out of Winnipeg. I believe 8 players that used to play for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are now in Hamilton. The last time we saw an exodus like this was when the Toronto Argonauts introduced a new head coach, Ryan Dinwiddie, and suddenly Corey Mace and a whole bunch of players went to Toronto with them.
You don't often hear a lot about general managers and assistant general managers and player loyalty, but Ted Gavea moving on from an assistant GM role into a general manager role obviously came into Hamilton with an agenda and a list of players from Winnipeg that he liked, and some flashy, some lesser known, but he seems to be pretty happy with the moves he's made to bring some of these guys along with him to the Ticats.
Listening to Kenny Lawler especially, he likens this to his move to Edmonton. There's been that compare and contrast that has been going on with him, and he says this is completely different than that experience. The money is still very good in Hamilton, but he sees it completely different because he thinks this team is going somewhere right now.
Montreal has not been making a big splash in free agency, only signing 3 players, but their focus is clearly on the defensive line.
The Alouettes need to figure out how to get a better pass rush. They've got a decent core back there. Lual Oguak is one of them. They need to help him by getting more rush from beyond him. Derek Wigan retired, and that was a need right away that was going to be fixed. They did re-sign Dylan Wynn here in the last couple of days, but the Alouettes overall, with the signings that especially they've made in free agency that were not a part of the CFL before, they have focused heavily on defensive line. They want to beat the Argonauts in that East Final, and they thought that maybe that defensive pass rush wasn't there.
Sean Oakman coming in is one of the more well-known names, I would say, of the free agents. And he's seen a lot of action over the last several years and moved around a little bit from Toronto to the Edmonton Elks and now to Montreal. But he's a guy that still has some game left and a lot to prove. And you want some of those veteran guys on your defensive line that have been through the battles as well. Somebody that maybe a young developing player can look up to.
Oakman, he had some great years in Toronto, but he fell into more spot duty at the end of his tour in Toronto and then followed that up in Edmonton as well. So I kind of think he's going to be sort of a guy that's going to spell off somebody for a few snaps.
I would agree with that, and certainly it's a way to prolong somebody's career to get into these situations as that rotational player. I think of somebody like Odell Willis that had a pretty outstanding defensive lineman career with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, moved to the Edmonton Elks, had a lot of sacks early on, but really kept himself around and had value as that additional, maybe that 5th defensive lineman that's rotating in on those pass rush situations. Sean Oakman is somebody that can fill a similar role. He's got a lot to give, but maybe not a regular every down defensive lineman.
Ottawa Red Blacks went heavy after defensive backs, and that was their big need. They let Damon Webb go, but they've decided to go after other defensive backs. Ottawa signaled that they felt they were close, that they're ready to make some noise in the East. They shook up Toronto in the final regular season game, but they couldn't do it again in the playoff game when they played the Argonauts. They're looking at that stepping stone. They want to get past whomever in the semis and make it to the final.
I think every team in the East believes that they are a contender for the number 1 spot in the East, and I don't think any of them are wrong. You can look at these rosters and make arguments about why any one of these teams can knock off the Toronto Argonauts from the number 1 spot. Ottawa, we saw what they did last year with a new starting quarterback. They made some noise. They've made some tweaks along the way. Drew Brown is coming back as the second year as the number 1 quarterback for the Red Blacks. They have a lot of confidence in what they've done. Coach Bob Dice has to be happy with what he's seen in the growth and development. And you're right, now they're saying it's time for us to take the next step. The Ticats, who missed the playoffs last year with an MOP caliber quarterback of Bo Levi Mitchell, also have to believe that they're ready to take the next step and contend for number 1. So I expect the East to be a real dogfight. And I would be very surprised if anybody runs away with the East like we had seen Montreal and Toronto do over the last couple of years.
10-8 might win you first place. And it's not because you're the weak sister in the league. It's because you're beating each other up and nobody can pull away. Now that may be 12-6 and everybody else is down to 9-9 or something. But it seems to me, and I agree with you completely, that the East right now is on a hair's breadth. It's just that close. You don't know which team is going to have the breakthrough, and injuries are going to be so massive. If Bo Levi Mitchell starts strong, plays strong, the Tiger Cats are going to make some noise. It's different in the West, though. There's this recency bias at the Blue Bombers. Well, nothing much really happened. I guess they're going to be back in first place, and I don't understand completely why. They took some major hits. The Rough Riders felt strong enough that they didn't go hard in free agency. The Elks have made major noise. The BC Lions brought in Jeremiah Mazzoli, which was a huge get for them. I don't know why they think that this West is Winnipeg and everybody else still.
I would anticipate Winnipeg taking a little bit of a step back, but I'm not sure if anybody else is ready to take a giant leap forward. So again, this could bunch up. If I was tasked with determining which division is stronger top to bottom, I would say right now it's the East by a lot. The West is going to be competitive for a different reason, and a couple of big question marks. One is Nathan Rourke, Buck Pierce at the helm with the BC Lions. How is that going to play out? Is he going to bounce back to where he was in 2022, or at least close to that? Because I think there was a lot of people a bit disappointed in his performance in 2024. He's going to have a full off-season, a full training camp ready to reestablish himself as the guy there. Saskatchewan's going with Trevor Harris, their number one guy for another season here. They were competitive last year, absolutely. And now you've got Corey Mace as the second year in that head coach role. And he's got to be comfortable with the players he has. He's been very vocal about his confidence in Harris and the rest of the team. And now Edmonton is the one that is trying to prove themselves that they're no longer at the bottom of the heap in the West.
I'm going to put it to you this way. If the West is going to be determined by a backup, who's got the best backup that can carry the team?
Oh, Cody Fajardo has been through the battles, won a Grey Cup, and was probably in contention for MOP before his injury last year. You could look at Jeremiah Mazzoli and everything he's been through as well, as certainly no slouch as the number 2 quarterback. But beyond that, there's some untested guys floating around for some other teams.
And this is my point. We hear it so often that he's a great backup, but he's not a starter. Well, tell you what, when the starter goes down, this guy becomes the starter. And I don't think you sign a guy to be a backup. You sign everybody in that quarterbacking room to be the starter.
The one team we haven't really dug into too much is the Calgary Stampeders. Again, ranked 9th in the 2 early power rankings. Vernon Adams Jr. and PJ Walker are the big 1-2 punch at quarterback to try to rejuvenate the Stampeders, but have they done enough elsewhere to get themselves back into contention?
Calgary, to me, is an enigma waiting to be unwrapped. They're either going to go one step down the rung again because they just haven't figured it out yet, or Vernon Adams Jr. is going to light a fire under that team. And watch out. That could be the most exciting team in the league to watch because every game is going to be in the high 40s. The Stampeders didn't do a lot to fix what was wrong with them. Do they believe their scouting department can do it? If so, they've done it before that way. Great for them. Right now, just looking at this, and we talked about the 2 early Amsoil power rankings. Well, the Stampeders are at the bottom for a reason. Nobody really ran away from free agency saying the Stampeders won.
You're talking about an enigma, and Vernon Adams Jr. is a prime example of that. He could throw 5 touchdown passes one week and 5 interceptions the next. And it's going to be dependent on him to find the level of consistency. Maybe he doesn't need to throw 5 TDs every week, but he's going to have to be in that 3 to 4 range and limit the mistakes.
They did sign PJ Walker last fall. Where does he fit into this process? Logan Bonner is back. It's Vernon Adams' show. But boy, if he stumbles, and let's say he does have that meteoric up and then a meteoric down, what do you do in week 3?
PJ Walker was brought in off the negotiation list last year. They gave him a bit of an introduction to Calgary and to the CFL. He was practice rostered and released at the end of the season, but came back as a free agent. So that means that what he saw was enough for him to re-sign. It's a new game for him. We talked about Nathan Rourke struggles coming back from the NFL to the CFL. This is now going to be PJ Walker's first taste of it. He's in his 30s. I believe he's 31 years old. He's played a lot of American football, and now at that age, it's going to be an adjustment to shift gears to the Canadian style.
That's a great point. When you move from the NFL to the CFL, the field is that much wider. Even though they move the hash marks in so that the field side throw isn't as far away from you, it's still a bigger field. You've got an extra 12 yards. And, of course, you've got an extra defender. And so many American quarterbacks can't get their head wrapped around that there's somebody else out there that I have to watch for. The ones that do succeed.
I know a lot of quarterbacks, when they come up and get a taste of Canadian football, they're excited about the unlimited motion, the waggle, all those nuances to the Canadian game. But you're right, it's a long way out to the wide side of the field when you're playing 65 yards wide versus 50.
Third down.
There's a new executive director at the CFL Players Association coming from the British Columbia Lions, David Mackey, who just recently retired.
This is a good hire. He seems to be a player that's well respected by his peers, and that's part of this role as well, is you want somebody that's closely connected to the players that you are involved in representing. You can have the people with the legal expertise somewhere else in the background as well, but his ability to connect, and that he's recently retired. He was playing up until the 2024 season, so he knows the majority of the players in this league. They know who he is, they know how he was on the field, and I'm sure his involvement with the Players Association as a player rep with the BC Lions goes a long way in it as well. There's a lot of familiarity and a lot of recognition there.
He'd been their union rep for the past 5 seasons. That tells you what the BC Lion players thought of him. He is, again, as you say, well-liked. He is a proven leader. Bring a different feel to the organization, certainly. Some youth, some vitality.
David Mackey's only 30 years old, 6 seasons as a player with the BC Lions. He is somebody that, if he starts off on the right foot, can be the executive director for the PA for many, many years to come. And he's starting out in a place, as I said, that he's got his finger on the pulse of the players, having been one over the last 6 seasons. And it will set them up well, I think, for negotiations when the next CBA comes to that negotiating table.
And the CFL president, of course, is Solomon Elamimian, who is another ex-BC Lion player, a person that is well respected. So you've got 2 players in charge over there. It really seems to set them up well for what they're going to be facing next, because ultimately, when you're looking at contract negotiations with the league, it's what do the players want? And you want somebody that's on the ground that understands what their needs are.
The question mark still out there is who will be the next commissioner of the CFL, and that's going to be something to keep an eye on as all of these pieces come together at the negotiating table.
Nathan Rourke, did he go too far when he went to the BC Lions practice facility after a snowfall and took it upon himself to shovel the field? That's your star quarterback pushing a shovel around the facility, trying to remove snow so he can practice.
If something was to have happened and he ended up injuring himself shoveling snow, this would be a story. The fact is he didn't. It speaks to his character of a guy that wants to get in there and get active with the team and with football. I think it's a great little feel-good story. I don't know if there's much more to it than that, but there has been some criticism heaped on Nathan Rourke for his performance coming back in 2024. So maybe some good news isn't a bad thing.
It may not be too bad, but I'm always going to think back to Larry Bird, who we know ended his NBA career with a chronic back problem. But that back problem came from him helping his mother pave her driveway. And he was digging, and that's when it all happened. That's your star player. I mean, he took his own choice to do it. It was something that came to me immediately when I heard about this. If Bird can injure himself with a shovel, certainly Nathan Rourke can. And then what if? And I'm not trying to fearmonger, but I'd rather him find somebody that is available and does this normally.
There are a lot of professional contracts with clauses written in prohibiting the player from riding motorcycles, skiing, snowboarding, water skiing, other dangerous things like that. How far down the list can you go? How many clauses can you put in to prevent somebody from doing something? We've seen players injured by lifting jet skis in and out of trucks. The list goes on of things that people can do. Baseball players notoriously injure themselves by sneezing or getting out of bed funny. So shoveling snow, that's a time-honored tradition here in Canada, and I don't think we can begrudge him for it.
Well, it was only a couple of centimeters, thankfully, but if it had been a dump, I think the Lions might have been much less glib about what happened and much more concerned.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble podcast. Audio worth watching.